Okay, so I thought we would do some of the problems, and it'll help you with chapter 18. I know it's a little late, but if you guys are having real problems with 18, I can always go back and adjust some of that stuff. So wanted to start with some of the simpler problems in 18, and then we'll move on to some of the more complicated ones. So I'm going to start with 8. So the mixing department of fresh foods has 50,000 units in October, and then of the 50,000, 40,000 were completed and transferred out, and then 10,000 were 20% complete. All the materials are added at the beginning and conversion costs are added throughout the process. So we want to do the total equivalent units for direct materials in conversion, and they're going to be different. So when we're looking at all the materials are added at the beginning of the process, think about it in terms of cost. So we have 50,000 units, 40,000 of them are completely done. So that means that we've incurred 40,000 units of cost. And then of the 10,000 remaining, they're 20% complete, but all the materials have all been added. So that means that we've incurred all of the costs for those, for the materials. So the equivalent units are going to be different. So for the direct materials, it's going to be 50,000 units. Now for the conversion costs, that's going to be different. That's going to be the 40,000 units that are complete, which means that 40,000 units we've incurred 100% of those costs. And then 10,000 units are 20% complete as far as conversion. So all I'm going to do is take my 10,000 and multiply it by 20%. So 2,000 here plus the 40,000 that were completed. So again, direct materials is 50,000, conversion costs 42. Okay, so if we're going to try and figure out the cost per unit, that is pretty easy. So let's take the direct materials. We've already considered 50,000 units, equivalent units for our direct materials, and the direct material cost is 48,000. So we're going to say 48,000 divided by 50,000. Okay, so 96 cents per equivalent unit. For the conversion costs, we have established 42,000 equivalent units, and our cost is 29,400 divided by 42,000. Okay, so 70 cents per equivalent unit there. So that one's not too bad. All right, so then the sort of last piece of this part of it is assigning costs to what has happened. So we've assigned a cost per unit. So now let's go ahead and take that per unit cost and assign it to the total cost here. So for the direct materials, we have 40,000 completed and done, and then 10,000 that we added at the beginning. So we have 10,000 in cost there. So I'm going to take 50,000 and multiply it by my 96 cents per unit. So for direct materials, our cost is 48,000. Now our equivalent units for conversion costs were 42,000, and it was 70 cents per unit. So our cost there is 29,400. Okay, so that's the first part of it. The next part of it is going to figure out how much was completed and transferred out and how much is still in work in process, because that's really what we care about. How much is still in work in process, how much has been transferred out. So when we're doing that, keep in mind that when we have direct materials cost that has been transferred out, we want to figure out how much has actually been transferred out. We're not really concerned with the equivalent units. So 40,000 units were transferred out, and we said that was 96 cents. So 38,400 for direct materials, and then conversion costs, again, 40,000 times the, I think it was 70 cents, 28,000 there. So we have 38,400 for direct materials, 28,000 that for conversion costs that we have incurred. Now I believe there was a beginning balance there that we had to add to that was given somewhere previously, but the most important part is figuring that out. Now for our work in process, what's left, what we have not completed, we had 10,000 that are still sitting in work in process, somewhere in the process there. So we have 96 cents for direct materials, so 9,600, and then for conversion costs, we have 7,000 there. So this is going to give us our conversion costs and our direct material cost there. Okay. All right, so let's talk about calculating conversion costs and unit costs. So I'm doing 13 now. So these are our costs here, the wages, the manufacturing overhead, and the water. So we're going to use FIFO, or first in, first out, to compute the February conversion cost. So let's take a look at this for a minute. Now, there's no beginning work in process. So that makes it a little bit easier for us, especially with the equivalent units. They had 100,000 liters that were completed in process. So we don't really need to worry about equivalent units in this case. We have 100,000 for direct materials and 100,000 for conversion costs, because only 100,000 were done. There's nothing left in work in process. There was nothing in beginning work in process. So that makes our life a little bit easier. So as far as direct materials, and direct materials, by the way, is the water, we have 170,000 divided by 100,000. So $1.70 per equivalent unit, or there's really no equivalent unit in this case. And then as far as the conversion costs, oops, move this out of the way, are the wages and the manufacturing overhead. Okay, so those two together are 45,000. We're going to divide that by our units that we produce of 100,000, 45 cents. Okay, so that gives us a per unit cost. And the nice thing about this one is that since we have the same costs, the same equivalent units for direct materials and conversion costs, we can just go ahead and add those together, and we don't have to figure it out separately. So there we go, 45 cents plus $1.70. So our total cost per liter, I think that was the unit, is $2.15, and that makes our life a whole lot easier in this case. We don't have to separate them out at all. Okay, so let's do 18. We're just computing the equivalent units. So you want to make sure that the materials and the conversion costs, when they're added, are they at the beginning, are they added at the end, are they added throughout the process? So let's take a look at the first one. So units in process at the beginning are 40% complete, units in process at the end are 30% complete, and materials are added at the beginning of the process. So when we're looking at that one, we know that 1,900 units were completed and transferred out. So that's going to be 100% of the cost there. And then we had 200 units that are in process at this point. So that is going to be an additional 100% because the materials are added at the beginning. So that gives us the first scenario. When we're looking at conversion costs, again, we had 1,900 that were completed and transferred out, so that's going to be 100%. And then in process, we had 200 units, 30% complete, so that's going to be 60 for conversion costs. So your total for direct materials for number one is 2,100, and then for conversion costs, 1,960. So for requirement two, again, with our direct materials, it's still going to be 100% of both of them because materials are added at the beginning. So you're going to have 2,100 equivalent units for direct material. For conversion costs, you're going to have the 1,900 that were transferred out, and you're going to have, instead of 30% this time, it's 70% that are completed or percent completed. So instead of it being 60, it's going to be 140. So you had 2,040 equivalent units for your conversion costs. And then finally, for number three, we have the units, materials are added at the end of the process. So in this case, for direct materials, we're only going to have 1,900 for equivalent units because all these that are still in process, we have not incorporated the direct material cost yet. So we have 1,900 there. And then for the conversion cost of the 1,900 that have been transferred out, plus 30% of the 200 here. Because if 70% are complete, then we have 30% that we still need to add to it. Okay? So let's take a look at the fourth one. Okay, so finally for the fourth one, we have 2,100 units for direct materials. And we have for conversion costs, the 1,900 that have been transferred out plus 70% complete. So we're looking at 140 equivalent units for conversion costs.